One of the sort of little tidbits I ran across in the course of this research, much of which was drawn from the vast digitized collections on the internet, when I plugged in the word Jewish peddlers, I got an enormous number of hits of Americans, and also in England, people who went to costume parties dressed as, quote, Jew peddler. And so that this was, kind of like you could be a pirate, you could be a king, or you could be a Jew peddler. So I thought, well, that was a little bit of a connection. So let me just say something about the argument here, the structure of the book, and what I see as the significance, and I certainly will try to link it to the Lower East Side. So the book asks a question, and the question is, how did the nature of this occupation, the need in order to apply this trade for recent immigrants to go to the doors of their customers, home by home, farm by farm, knock on the door and say, in whatever the language was, the equivalent of, "Good morning, ma'am, would you like to look in my bag?" Okay, so that's how they functioned, and I'll say a little bit more about the intricacies of it, but how did this, again, essential nature of the occupation fulfill three major functions in modern Jewish history, and I'd also say in the histories of the places to which the Jews went. So first, because the title is Roads Taken, the Great Jewish Migration, how did these peddlers and the opportunity, how did these men, because they're all men, how did the opportunity to peddle shape this mass Jewish migration, which from the end of the 18th century through the 1920s make possible the migration of about 1/3 of world Jewry. So 1/3 of the Jewish people, be they from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, wherever the lines are between those places, the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, 1/3 moved. Okay, and how did peddling structure that out-migration? Okay, so in terms of Jewish history, this is a remarkable phenomenon that a people that had lived in these old homes, by the 1920s are living in North America, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, South Africa, Australia, as well as a number of places within Europe which conventionally are not thought of New World, let's say places like Ireland or Scotland or Wales or Sweden, but for the Jews these were new places. There had been no Jewish population there. So the occupation is, we might think of it as the locomotive, that drew out, that propelled this mass migration. Okay, the second part of the question, or let's say the second question, is back to the nature of the occupation, knocking on the door, saying, "Good morning, ma'am, please would you like to look at my bag?" Crossing the threshold into their customers' homes, something, by the way, I'm sure if somebody knocked on my door and wanted to tell me something, I'd call the police, right? How did this play a role in fostering Jewish integration in these places? Okay, the fact that the Jews crossed the thresholds of their customers' homes, strangers, the Jew is a stranger to them, they are strangers to him, and this very lowly occupation, this very lowly and kind of quotidian, ordinary, literally pedestrian process became a way for New World peoples of all kinds, of all religions, language groups, races, nationalities, to come to learn about the Jews and to, in essence, normalize them. Okay, that the Jew was not just this kind of mythic character from maybe the pages of the Bible, But he was this guy, he was Mr. Yampolsky or Mr. Zeev, who came to your home every week and sold you something. And one of the characteristics of the occupation as it was applied in the New World is that the Jewish peddlers slept in the homes of their last customer of the day. So it was not just that they came, they sold, they left, but 5 days a week, they slept in the homes of their customers. Okay, and so this opened up a kind of space and a time for interreligious, intercultural communication. And I say something in the book that these peddlers and their customers engaged in a global enterprise of ecumenical encounter, utterly unplanned, untutored, unstructured, but every time the peddler came into the home of his customer, and it could be in Wales or in New South Wales, it could be in Maine, it could be in Mississippi, and the customer said something to the effect of, "Well, would you like to eat here? Would you like me to eat you?" And the peddler said, "I can't eat your food," which led to the question, why not? Okay? Well, my religion doesn't allow it. Now, do be assured that many of the peddlers were very happy to eat anything that was given to them. So I don't want you to come away thinking they were all exceedingly pious. And many of them said, I didn't want to, but I was so hungry, I was so tired. But when they asked that question, why not? I'm a Jew. I said, well, why can't Jews eat pork? Or why can't Jews eat squirrel or bear, whatever the family was eating? And so the process of this, again, very quotidian occupation educated the population of customers around the world to who the Jews were and what they did. And one might say that in the main, the reaction they got, the reception was extremely positive. Okay? And in fact, there were some oral history projects done in places like South Carolina and Georgia in the 1970s and 80s, elderly men who had been peddlers in the 1920s. And the interviewer always said, well, tell me about the anti-Semitism you experienced. And to a person, the informant said, well, I actually didn't. I mean, I was robbed, but I wasn't robbed because I was a Jew. Sometimes people didn't want me in my house. And one of them told actually a story where he knocks, the woman opened the door, and she looks at him and she says, I don't let Yankees into my house. And he says, I'm not a Yankee, I'm a Jew. He said, oh, then you can come in. Again, the second part of this is the way in which Jews become integrated into the places where they sold in this ambulatory occupation. And the third is the way in which this experience changed the Jews. Okay, that they came as a result of these encounters to see their customers as not just non-Jews who hated them and not as anti-Semites, but as people who accepted them and who were interested in their experiences, in their culture, in their way of life. And I'd say it kind of created a kind of softer, gentler Judaism that was very much the product of the New World. So again, the migration, the integration, and then its impact upon the Jews themselves. So let me say, I think I'm going to take 5 more minutes, okay? And again, I've already said something about this, where they left, where they went to, what they sold. So as I said, they came from all of Europe, from Alsace in the west, all the way to the Russian Empire. Young Jewish men, or not so young men, left in greater or lesser percentages, depending on where and when, with peddling as the first New World occupation. Okay, it's the first thing they do when they set foot on the soil of Ireland, or set their feet down on the soil of South Africa. Okay, in South Africa, they were actually called smoes. Okay, and all these linguists are trying to figure out what the word smoes means, but that's what Jewish peddlers were called. So from, again, Alsace in the west to the Russian Empire in the east to Ukraine, this migration was facilitated by the footsteps of the peddlers. And as I said, they went to the entirety of the New World. And there was pretty much no place they went that they didn't go to. Most of these places were opened up to them through the colonial expansion of European countries. I mean, they were the beneficiaries of European colonialism. And so, you know, when the South Africa opens up, when the British open Australia as I mean, they claim it, they open it up, you know, first for convicts. Right away, there are Jews who show up to peddle. There was a remarkable little piece about the early 1920s when Shell Oil opened its first oil refineries in Curacao. And so they recruited peasant laborers from around the Caribbean to come and work in the oil fields, the oil refineries. Most of these were men and their families who for the first time were earning a wage. Okay, that is, previously they had been subsistence peasant farmers. They grew what they could, they ate what they could grow, having given most of it to their landowner. But once they're earning a wage, okay, they now have a little excess capital, a little excess money in their pockets. And they said within a few weeks, a handful of Polish Jewish men show up to sell stuff, okay, to these oil refinery workers. So it's like they sniffed out, okay, the expansion of capitalism and the expansion of colonial enterprises, either literally or figuratively. They sold to farm families all over the world. They sold on plantations. They sold on sugarcane plantations, rubber plantations, coffee plantations. They sold to miners, coal, diamonds, gold, silver, iron ore, whatever. They sold in logging camps. They would go into communities of textile mills. In that case, as in the case of the plantation workers and the miners, they sold to people who didn't want to patronize the company store. And so the peddler could come in, sell at a much lower rate than the company store, and their selling had nothing to do with the power of the owners. Okay? So they went everywhere and anywhere that they could, and nearly all of these were places where Jews had never penetrated before, and they became the first Jews who entered the region and, in essence, introduced the Jews to the residents. Wherever they went, they shared two characteristics. And again, it doesn't matter if it's Manitoba, okay, or the Cape Colony. Okay. First, they didn't sell necessities. They didn't sell food and they didn't sell fuel. Okay, but rather they sold a category of goods that we might think of as goods that we would all consider necessities, by the way. But it's not. They weren't selling to us. Okay, but since they were selling to primarily poor people, many of whom had never had cash before, they were selling items that were associated with cosmopolitanism, with the city, with the better off classes, and were items that we might pair of shoes. Okay, so they had obviously gone for generations barefoot. Okay, now they have shoes. They sold pictures and picture frames for the walls. They sold mirrors. Okay, needles, thread, buttons, other kinds of items associated with the home, cutlery, dishes. So again, you can live without towels, sheets and pillowcases. So you can live without all these things, although again, we could not. And I'd throw a fit if there was no clean sheet. I'd probably run out in the middle of the night, to some 24-hour Bed Bath & Beyond, to buy a sheet. These were new to these customers. So this is something they shared. And obviously, as technology advanced, okay, that is, if we're talking about 1900 as opposed to 1800, some of them carry Singer sewing machines. Okay, so they obviously didn't do that in 1800, but end of the 19th century they were. So as the technology changed, they carried different kind of stuff, but the stuff still was of that quality that one writer called populux, okay, popular luxury. Okay, so that is something that transcended geography. The other part of it that was the same regardless of where they were, and here the Lower East Side actually plays a role because the peddlers worked on a weekly cycle. Okay, and in Ireland they were actually called weekly men. Okay, and in parts of South America and the Spanish-speaking world they were sometimes called semana nicks. Okay, so you have the Spanish word of semana, of a week, and sometimes in England they were called wochers. So, Woch being week. So they operated out of some Jewish wholesaler, okay, some Jewish shopkeeper, some place where there were other Jews. It could be a small number, a larger number, and many of them they were on the Lower East Side. And then they would go out to New Jersey. They'd go up to the far reaches of Westchester. Okay, so they would they worked out of some hub of Jewish life. They would leave this hub on Sunday, get to their territory, and every peddler had his own territory. Okay, they never competed with each other because they tended to get their goods from the exact same suppliers, and so the supplier would give them a map and a list of where to go. They always, again, around the world called it their Medina, okay, their kingdom or their state. And they would go to the same houses week after week. Monday these houses, Tuesday these houses, and I sold on the installment plan. So somebody had bought a woman, and they sold, by the way, to women. All around the world, their customers were women. Let's say they sold a religious painting, a Last Supper, to a woman in Quebec, in rural Quebec. Okay, it maybe cost $1, and so he would charge 5 cents a week. Okay, well that left quite a few weeks to keep coming back. Okay, and hopefully on the second week or the third week, you say, by the way, what do you have? What do you have that's new? So that is to buy another item to extend the number of weeks that they would come there. So they had their Monday customers, their Tuesday customers, their Wednesday customers, and so on. And then on Friday, they would return to what was to that center hub of Jewish life, where, well, some of them did talk about enjoying the Sabbath and having good food and not having to sleep among strangers, and some of them actually talked about going to religious services. Not too many, even though they just may have not felt the need to say that. But what was most important is that on Saturday night, all around the peddler's world, the peddler would then go to their wholesaler, pay them what they owed, find a way to bank what they had, their own profit, fill up their bags, and then in the words of Willie Nelson, get on the road again. And so this weekly circuit defined them regardless of where they went. Most peddlers start out by foot. Okay, and with the descriptions we have from their memoirs and from observations of others, I mean, these men were carrying 100 pounds, 120 pounds on their backs. And so the first thing they did with money that they had accumulated was to either buy or rent a horse and wagon. Okay, so that they graduated then to being a little bit, not only to be able to cover a larger territory, but also to be able to carry heavier items, okay, and in a way diversify. Notably, every place they went, when they had a horse and wagon, they not only could sell bigger, heavier items, but they also could develop a kind of sideline business, which is not only were they selling stuff, but they were collecting stuff. That is, they became the junk collectors, the scavengers, who went around the countryside getting scraps of paper, old bones, rags, incredible number of collected herbs, particularly ginseng. Okay, all over the world, and then they would bring and often they entered into relationships with the women, saying, if you can collect X amount of scraps of paper, scraps of feathers, you can get something for free, or I'll pay you. Okay, and for the women, this was, I think, extremely important because it gave them an economic independence within their families. And some of the women said, my husband never even knew I was doing this. Okay, so that they could have their money, and the husband didn't know they were buying jewelry, which was another thing the peddlers sold. And then when the peddler comes back, now his wagon's not empty returning, but the wagon is now full of the stuff that had been cast away by others. And he then sells this to junkyard dealers. And by the way, the junk business was, by the 1900, firmly in Jewish hands all over the world. Okay, all over the New World, that Jews ran junkyards and junk shops, and has obviously very negative implications by using that word junk, but they didn't think of it as negative at all, but it was actually kind of a little gold mine for them. So one might say, and I'm going to then draw this to a close, the other characteristic that we might say was universal in the for New World peddlers and made them different than Old World peddlers, is that it was not a lifetime occupation or a lifetime sentence, but it was a stage in somebody's life. It was a year, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, and people always say, how many? And I say, I can't answer that because these are not exactly people who left bountiful records, and they don't show up in censuses. Because when the first census is taken and then the next, they probably have changed occupations several times. But it was not something somebody did for a lifetime, but rather it was a first stage to get a toehold in the economy of their new home, and as such, they create the outlines not only of Jewish communities, but they help make Jews visible and, again, accepted people in the places to which they went. So I think I'm going to draw that to a close then. And okay.
Oh, okay. Hi. So I have to get up on the stool.
Not so elegant.
The first thing. So let me start. I just want to say a few words about the book, and then get into some questions to Hasia, and trying to also link up to some. Link up to some issues for today, although it is a little tricky because we don't have peddlers anymore of this sort. So let me first start out by saying that, as you can already tell from Hasia's description, that this is a really interesting, wonderful, and very important book. That it's about people who are central to the Jewish immigrant experience, but who have been too often ignored or overlooked or forgotten in the Jewish immigrant story. And Hasia makes that clear in the beginning to her book. She talked a lot about different things that she does in the book, but first of all, I love this notion of the roads, which you'll see when you get the book and read it. She has all the chapters sort of tie into this theme of the road. It's a very beautifully written book. It's engaging, it's analytically astute. And it takes us with this image of the road on the reasons for the migration, of why so many Jews came to the new lands, on how and why so many became peddlers, although I have to say, as a sociologist, I kept on looking for the numbers, right? But you say, in my sociology world, right? Saying, how many of them actually were there? But it's a problem. You can't really tell. And of course, people were in and out of the occupation. On the nature of the peddling occupation along the road, and its impact for the peddlers and for their families, on what Hasia calls the perils of the road, and finally the legacies of peddling for the societies they came to, not only for the Jews themselves. So I have a lot of questions, but since we don't have so much time, I'm going to ask some of them that have some link up a little bit to the present, since that's why I'm supposedly here, right? So immigration scholars today write a lot about the making of ethnic niches among immigrant groups. That's a big theme. You know, why is it that certain groups become concentrated in particular occupations? And then how and why this becomes self-reproducing. Once a group gets into a small number, get into an occupation, why does it then accumulate and more go into this as newcomers flock to fields where co-ethnics have already established a foothold through their friendship and kinship networks. And one of the things also that social scientists are interested in today also is why it is also that employers have certain preferences for a particular work, how that works in the process as well. So it's not just that immigrants themselves are relying on kin and friends to get jobs, but also employers often have preferences for particular groups. So in the case of the Jewish peddler, and it's a really fascinating case, partly because it's obviously so many Jews went into this occupation, but it's international. It's not just in a national context. We're talking about a sort of international niche, right? Not in one economy. So let me get to my question that I'm going to ask Hasia. So one is, why did so many Jews in the Great Migration become peddlers? And also, I think to give a sense of this, in what period did the Jewish immigrant peddler particularly thrive? So.
Okay, so the why. Okay, so I mean, it wasn't completely disconnected from the kinds of occupational patterns they had before migration. It was not an unknown occupation. It wouldn't have struck a young Jewish man. We in fact have a wonderful memoir by somebody who eventually becomes a Hebrew poet in the United States, and he said, "Well, okay, father says you have to go to America. It's, and he said, okay, I guess I'll become a peddler." I mean, it was just assumed that was the sort of starting occupation. So because they knew this, but I think more important, peddling, like many of these ethnic niches, depends on trust within a community. Okay, so the wholesaler or the supplier gives the peddler a mess of goods. Now, the guy can leave. I mean, he can abscond. I mean, he is now miles and miles away from the person who gave him the merchandise. There's kind of nothing stopping him from disappearing with his goods or with his money, but the bonds of trust within the community and the need to maintain faith and to replicate the kinds of communal patterns was so strong that both sides of the equation, the supplier and the peddler, were, in the main kept up the obligations one had to the other. As a way of getting started, it was probably the single best way to learn about the country you were going to. I mean, you had to learn the language. Okay, we think about the sweatshop workers, the people who, some of whom are in the tenement museum, in the tenements, there's the museum, but who lived in the tenement, and I mean, they worked primarily with other Yiddish-speaking immigrants. The boss was a Yiddish speaker. The kind of steward in the shop, the supervisor was a Yiddish speaker. He came back to the tenement, or she came back to the tenement, and I guess except for the Baldizis, they're all speaking Yiddish. Well, I say that was certainly a point of entry, but the peddlers immediately have to learn English, Spanish, French, Mayan, Cherokee, Afrikaans, whatever the dominant language is. And so many of them in their memoirs say, I wanted to learn about this country, and so I became a peddler. It required no capital to get started, okay, as opposed to opening a store. didn't need anything, it only required that you know somebody, and the somebody was your cousin, your uncle, your brother, somebody else from your town.
Okay. So I guess one of the to move on to another question. Oh, sorry. I think roads not taken is a complex view. It's not a Panglossian view of the life of the peddler. You've already, in fact, the thing that I guess as I kept reading this, and I would like to know more about this notion that they were on the road and slept in the houses of the people. You all, right? I mean, that's a unique feature of this job, right, of this occupation. And, you know, they faced a lot of difficulties on the road. I mean, they were lonely. You write about that it was physically hard. They never knew where they would sleep. There were the dangers from robbery. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the difficulties and why, despite the difficulties, and they're lugging around 130 pounds, and do you see the picture on the front of this? That's this little man, you know? I mean, that's a lot on your back. You know, why did they persevere in this?
You know, they persevered despite all of those difficulties, and we might throw in also the possibilities of getting murdered. And it happened often enough. It was actually very good for me because those murders left paper trails where most of the positive transactions didn't. Okay, so but when a peddler got murdered, I got to learn a lot about them because it paid off. Okay, in a relatively short period of time, the new immigrant is able to acquire enough money to fulfill the obligation, the goals of the migration, which is either to get married or to call for wives and children who were in the old home, or who maybe were left in some city, and they could now be reunited, and they could earn enough, they could save enough money so that they didn't have to do it. So it was an occupation that nobody went into thinking, okay, this is my calling in life. Okay, and so the perseverance was a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. Okay, yes, I'm going to suffer. Yes, I'm going to. It's going to be miserable. I have no illusions. But I think it's going to pay off. And so one of the best memoirs we have was a man who came from Bavaria in the 1840s, and he's peddling in western Massachusetts. And I mean, he writes this diary. I mean, you know, kind of says, "Oh, youth of Bavaria, stay home. You know, better that you should suffer all of the indignity of life back there than have to walk through these howling storms and have to deal," and he thinks Americans are kind of ignorant and gross, and you know, you have to abandon the faith of your father. I mean, it's really intense, miserable. Well, what happens to him? His brother, within about 2 years, moves to Chicago, which was then a prairie town. Says, "Why don't you join me?" He opens a dry goods store in Chicago. He is present at the first convention of the Republican Party, becomes friendly with Lincoln. He's the registrar of deeds of Chicago. And when Lincoln leaves Illinois to go to Washington to assume the presidency, he stops at Abraham Cone's store, and Abraham Cone gives him an American flag that Abraham, has stitched with a Hebrew verse from the book of Joshua about be strong. And I mean, okay, so when he's writing the diary, yes, I mean, he's saying, this is so miserable, why did I do it? Well, the payoff was that store in Chicago and becoming registrar of deeds.
Well, he was a big success story. I'm sure they're not all that successful.
No,
but
for sure.
I think that it's interesting about this occupation, and maybe one of the reasons why there's not as much written about it is because it was a sort of short stint for many people. It wasn't, so maybe when they look back at their life,
right.
they thought, they thought of them as store owners, not, because that's what they really did most of their lives. They weren't really peddling for a long time.
Okay,
so
absolutely.
it's kind of a, we talk about today, one of the reasons that immigrants are willing to come here and do these awful jobs and make low wages and persevere in whatever they have to, is because they think, well, it's better than it was back in the home country, and maybe eventually I'll go home. I mean, that is something that people often think about, even if they don't go home. They think that they might. So in this case, for the Jew, I mean, in the scheme of things, I mean, their aim was to own a store. So this was a part, you know,
It was just
the miseries of peddler.
It was the dues you paid to get that
Yeah,
store.
to get the store. I'm trying to think of what to, I have a whole bunch of questions here, but I can't possibly ask them all. One question that interests me, I'll ask this now, maybe we'll go back to some other stuff, is that peddling is mostly long gone. And it's not an occupation that immigrants take up anymore. So what factors spelled the end of immigrant peddling on this kind of massive scale? Because it was a massive scale.
Right. Okay, so are there a number of factors that was its death knell, although it's notable that it actually goes on even after World War II in one form or another. And I was doing research on this in Australia, and I had somebody who was driving me to an archive, and you know, what are you doing? And I told him, and he said, oh, you know, I grew up in, and he mentioned some relatively remote region of Australia where there were coal mines. And he said there were actually Jewish peddlers then in the 1950s. And so a certain number of Holocaust survivors and in places like Australia took that as their first occupation. So it actually goes on. But basically the improvements in transportation, so a family can now own a car and they can drive to the market, to the shops. They don't need the peddler to come to their house, is probably the most salient. I mean, there's a certain irony that the mail order catalogs certainly chipped away at them. And so the two most famous mail order catalogs were Spiegel. And so Marcus Spiegel was the brother of the founder of the Spiegel catalog, had been a peddler, and Sears. And so Julius Rosenwald, who's the president of Sears, although he didn't found the catalog, he certainly takes it to its great fame and distribution. His father came as a peddler. And so that changes in technology, in the nature of marketing, but I think the transportation was really the really crucial part.
So I'm trying, my assignment here was to link this up in some way to the present. And so I was trying to think, well, what about some of the things that you wrote about that have some parallels or have with the present, just to throw some out. And then we maybe would open up for questions, and to Hasia particularly, and I was thinking, for example, of the Chinese workers who live right around here, right, who, I mean, they're not peddling, but they're using Chinatown or this neighborhood, Lower East Side, as a base, leaving their families here and going off to work in restaurants, you know, in different zip codes around the country, right? Just is how they often know about where they're, right? And so they're not peddling. They're going to work in restaurants, which is different. They're not sleeping in people's houses. They're not moving along the road, but they are leaving, you know, their base here and moving away. The other thing I was thinking of was, you know, the leaving, I mean, the peddlers were on their own. I mean, right? They were, and they're actually an incredible group, right? I mean, there they were in the middle of nowhere, right, often, really.
Yep.
You know, didn't know where they were going to sleep. I mean, I don't know why that gets to me.
Oh, no, because it's so...
I don't know why.
It's so transgressive to how we live.
The notion of that you don't even know where you're going to sleep, that you don't speak the language of the people. I mean, it seems right. They're leaving their children and families behind. But then I was thinking, of course, today, many immigrants come leaving their families and children behind, and in some cases they're not here with documents, and so it's even more difficult for them. So I mean, there's also that, you know, parallel. And of course what you emphasize also is the role of these friendship and kinship networks in getting people jobs, which we also see today. And then ultimately they end up in small business, most of them. And of course, we know that many immigrants today, not most, but you know, a good proportion of immigrants end up in small business. And that, I guess, leads us, maybe that I can get back, because I think, you know, that's something that social scientists, again, struggle with today. You know, there's a tendency to romanticize small business. And, you know, it's got its pluses. You know, you earn more having your own business than typically in a low-level service or factory job. You're your own boss. You know, there are the profits are great. I mean, you earn more. The studies have shown that. Yet, You know, you work hard. The profits are not that great. 1 out of 2 small businesses fails. I mean, there are a lot of downsides to businesses too. And, you know, the groups that have been most successful and whose children have been most successful in using business as a springboard for mobility have been those groups who themselves have come over with, as we say, a lot of human capital and education, like the Koreans or the Russian Jews or the Cubans, so that in a way their children are recouping the status of the parents rather than, you know, moving on that much ahead. So I don't know, that you don't really, I mean, you're mostly focusing on the peddlers. So let me ask one last question to get us back to peddlers, okay? Because you talk a lot, and one of the nice things one of the excellent things about the book is that it gives a sense of the sort of complexities and contradictions and involved in the life of the peddler. So on the one hand, the peddlers, and as Hasia really does emphasize, tend to develop good relations with their customers, which in fact they cultivated. That makes sense, right? They wanted to sell to them. But there were also negative views of peddlers that were widespread. You said they inspired fear as strangers, they had a different religion, they have different language, dress, occupation, they were transients, they were outside the local moral community. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this tension between the good relations with the customers on the road, but yet the prejudices they also experience.
Okay, so there's in a sense no one answer, but rather the positive relations with the customers were with the customers. It's home by home, family by family. The peddler was this person who they had warm feelings for, whom they patronized, even when there was political and economic pressure not to do so. And certainly every place they went, local merchants hated them. Okay, local merchants wanted to keep them out and devised one method or another to make peddling difficult. But in every instance that was documented, that I saw, I mean, maybe there have been others that I didn't see, but I think I saw a lot of them, where there were these political controversies over peddling and efforts by local merchants and local political elites to ban the peddlers, the customers stayed with the peddlers. And so I'm just going to offer 2 little anecdotes, but they're just the kind of tip of the iceberg, as it were. So in the first decade of the 20th century, the Parliament in the Cape Colonies, again what eventually becomes South Africa, actually held inquests about the peddlers. There were too many of them. They were overrunning the country, all sorts of things wrong with them. And one legislator got up and he said it perfectly for me, if it were up to me, I'd expel them all. But our wives and daughters would never put up with it. Okay. In another case, there was a 2-year boycott of the Jewish peddlers instigated by a priest in Limerick, Ireland. Okay, and actually talks about this. It enters into the drama of Ulysses. And there was a Redemptorist priest who said, the peddlers are agents of Britain, even though they were all just from Lithuania. And they, embody all sorts of evil characteristics, and they're cheating, and the women who buy from them are too stupid to know the value of money. And so he organized a group of priests, okay, who served under him to basically follow the peddlers around. So the priests are on their bicycles following the priests. And so one reported incident that got into a local newspaper was a woman has just purchased a blanket from the peddler, and she's holding onto one end of it, and the priest is trying to pull it away from her to give it back to the peddler. And you say, don't pay him money you owe him from before. He's a bloodsucker, and don't buy anything new. And so she just yanks the blanket out of the priest's hand and says, get off my property. He never did anything wrong. I want this blanket. Okay. So yes, there were people who reviled them. They saw them as economic competition as well as disrupting local social relationships. But the customers stayed with them, and when the peddlers stopped peddling but opened up shops in the local area, the same customers continued to patronize them.
I just have one more question that I didn't actually write down, but just came to me, so I'm going to ask it. So were there other groups peddling?
Okay.
I mean, did they have, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
okay. Yes.
there we go. I mean,
Yes.
this was an economic opportunity, obviously, in a lot of these places. So did the...
Sure. So for one thing, in the earlier part of the 19th century and the latter part of the 18th century in the United States, there was the ubiquitous Yankee peddler. Okay, and these were young men from New England. You know, the soil has been depleted. They can't afford to stay, so they have to do something. So they go and they peddle in the mid-Atlantic, they peddle in the South, and notably, everything that was said by local, you know, writers or commentators against the Jewish peddlers said against the Yankee peddlers. Just change the word, and it's the same language. Okay, there were certainly some Germans who peddled, there were some Irish who peddled, but the only other group in which peddling was, again, that engine, the locomotive, were Arabs. Okay. Particularly people from what is now Lebanon, Syria, Christians, okay, went all over the world to exactly the places the Jews went and peddled there. They avoided each other. I mean, because there was no point in competing. Okay, so they avoided each other, and certainly I would love to see somebody do a study of these Arab peddlers and to see how similar or how different these experiences were. The fact they were Christian would certainly have had some different valence then, because the peddler was not in the position of having to explain, well, you know, well, I don't eat pork, or I'm not, again, it's just one story, but I kind of have to tell it, of a Jewish peddler who he woke up in the morning and he wanted to do his morning prayers, and so he's standing in the corner of the house, and he puts on his prayer shawl and he takes out his leather straps, the tefillin, and the story told by the customer is, she says, I ran downstairs and I saw him with these ropes, and she said, I ran upstairs and I said to my husband, Moses is trying to hang, the peddler's trying to hang himself. Okay, so that, and again, he then explains, I'm not hanging myself, don't worry. This is how Jewish, he probably said Jews, obviously he meant Jewish men, this is how they pray. And so the fact that the Arab peddlers were Christians would have given them a point of convergence around Christianity, but I think it would be a fabulous study.
Well, maybe at that.
Yeah, good questions. And I think you might have people go up.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, I'm just going to call people, but. So if anyone has questions, please come on up. We invite you up to the microphone to ask the question. If you feel uncomfortable being up here, I'm happy to translate your question for everyone else. But and I'll just raise your hand and I'll call you up. So, sir, come on up.
Did Levi Strauss start off as a peddler?
Okay, so the question was, do you want me to do that?
No, you can do it too. I'm okay.
Okay, so the question was, did Levi Strauss start out as a peddler? Yes. And so he peddled to the miners, and he obviously made good. But yeah, that's how he started out. And there were an enormous number of Jewish peddlers in the California gold fields. And so the miners, want stuff. They want, a hairbrush, suspenders, equipment. So yeah, that's how he started.
I'm just curious about this.
Come on up. Yeah.
I'll go up.
It's being filmed. We're being recorded. It'll be nice.
Right.
I'm just curious about the network of peddlers. Did peddlers know where they were going to go when they were in Europe before they left? Were there certain hot spots?
Okay.
How did they know when to go to California for the gold rush? Like
Yeah.
how is this information transmitted?
Okay, so that's a great question, and on some level it's going to be unanswerable. But it is remarkable that this information flowed to Europe or to the Ottoman Empire or to North Africa, without the telephone or without the internet. They didn't get faxes or Twitters saying, hey, there's opportunity now in Ireland. But the information flowed. And it was very specific. That is, people from a few different towns in the province of Kovno in Lithuania all went to Ireland. Okay, and so the first one who's there, or the first couple, we don't know who those first couple were, but they send letters back. They send fare back to their nephew, to their cousin. Hey, there's opportunity here. And the subsequent arrivals already come to, now there's some people from Achmian, it was one of those villages in Kovno, which was connected to Dublin. Okay, there are already a couple merchants in Dublin who are from Achmian, and they become the suppliers for the next batch, and then the next batch, and then the next batch, and they tell them where to go, how to do it, okay, how to know the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant home. Why? Because when you get to a Catholic home, the first thing you should take out of your bag, okay, they said, were the rosaries and the holy pictures and the statues, because even if the customer isn't going to buy them, because they already have those, they're going to really like you. But if you take those out in a Protestant home, okay, forget it, you're being thrown out. So there are hot spots. The Jewish press does play a role, and there's a great article in the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums, one of the German Jewish newspapers in the 1850s, and the reporter says, I'm walking up and down Broadway, and I see the names of all these Jewish merchants on these magnificent stores. 5 years ago, they were all peddlers. Okay, so the Jewish press is one. Family was much more important. This Abraham Cohen, who becomes Lincoln's buddy, the Registrar of Deeds, he, when he gets off the boat, again, it's like 1846, and he comes to, it's right before Rosh Hashanah, and he goes to synagogue down here, and he sees somebody from his hometown, and he says, I'm here now, and he said, what should I do? Go out peddling. Okay, and he said, I'll set you up with after the holiday, I'll set you up with my brother. But I think your question gets to the heart of what I think is actually one of the most fascinating parts of immigration history, is how does this get started, and how do people know where to go? Okay, and how did these networks function in an age of very, very slow technology?
Did you have a question?
So, this has been marvelous so far.
Thank you. So far. I hope it doesn't get worse.
And I'll tell you, it's a little bit personal for me because, number one, I'm the archivist for the Redemptorist Fathers.
Oh, wow. Okay, sorry about
Well,
that.
don't be sorry.
Father
It sounds just like our guys.
Okay.
And also, I'm from Western Massachusetts.
Okay.
So you're...
Gotten you double.
Yeah, I got the double whammy. But my question is about motivations. I remember back in my own youth how I would take jobs that were not spectacular, let's put it that way. And I vowed to myself, if ever I get the chance, I will never do this job again. And so I'm wondering about the motivation for doing better than carrying a 130-pound pack on one's back.
Okay, so that's, again, a great question, and it really, again, goes to the heart of the immigration story. But for me, by the way, it was being a waitress in college. I said, this is like the worst, and I was fired because I did a terrible job at it. But they migrated in order to do better. I mean, that is, they understood it was an economic calculation. It wasn't, they didn't say, America or South Africa, but they migrated because the circumstances in the world they lived in had constricted to the point where basically young people could not make a go of life. Okay, they couldn't get married, or they couldn't support their children, and they understood that in this new world, again, opened up through colonialism and through the spread of capitalism, and the United States in particular, because about 85% of them go to the United States. So it's really, the book could have been just about the United States, and I just would have lost a lot of these good stories. But they learned, again, through the cousin who had come there first, or through the Jewish press, or through talk or books or whatever, that there were places in the world where they didn't have to live the way they did in Lithuania or in various parts of the Ottoman Empire or in Alsace in the 1830s, where they could make a go of life. And in that calculation, okay, should I stay or should I go? Okay, going was the, in a way, for a particular class, was really almost the only option.
When did they stop wanting to be peddlers?
Oh, as soon as, they never wanted to be peddlers. In other words, they wanted to be peddlers because they learned, they knew that's the way to get started. And so probably day one on the road, Abraham Cohn is probably saying to himself, how much longer do I have to endure this? Okay, so it was never, they didn't go into it with the idea that this was going to be a life occupation. It was, this is what my cousin told me, or this is what I've observed, is the fastest, I don't want to say least painful, but the fastest way to achieve what is the goal, which is to be self-employed, okay, and to be able to live a life without deprivation.
At least a life that was settled.
Yeah, settled, yes, okay.
It could still have been different.
Yeah, I mean, most of these...
Well, I mean, just to put a little, I mean, it didn't mean that they were moving from peddling to, being Levi Strauss, a millionaire, I mean, it was not that quick. But no, and also most were not that successful.
Right.
I presume that most had small stores.
Most of them owned small stores, and so on the one hand, one of the sort of dramas of this is that there were some people who became so phenomenally successful, and I'll throw out the name of Lehman. Okay, or Guggenheim. Okay, I mean, these people obviously did really well. The Strausses of Macy's. Okay, but most of them end up, small town shopkeepers, owners of a small dry goods store or women's clothing store, men's clothing store. But that was successful also. What I didn't find, and honestly, I really looked for it. I wanted to find the failures. And so one of the things I did is I looked at the records of some, I couldn't see them all, Jewish charitable societies where they dealt with the real destitute, and they would often give the occupation. Okay, and also orphanages where they would give the father's occupation, and I didn't see, what I saw were street peddlers. Okay, the guys who would have been out here on Orchard Street, okay, but never on the road peddlers.
And then just to add, to bring us also to the contemporary, right? Mm-hmm. That, when this for all immigrants, who often, if they have a difficult time even in their small business, they tend to transfer their aspirations to their children. And that makes it seem worthwhile, in terms of that. Maybe they're not going to be super successful, but they see this as opening, and their move as opening opportunities for their children that their children wouldn't have always had if they hadn't come. So.
I mean, one of my best sources, by the way, were obituaries. And this is definitely a book that could have not been written without the internet. And so on some of these huge search engines, again, I put in the word Jewish peddler, and I got hundreds of obituaries from really obscure small-town newspapers. Okay, and so the obituary read something like this, Joseph Leibowitz, 93, owner, tip-top department store, from Duma, Arkansas. Obviously, I would have never known him. And so the obituary begins by saying, whatever name he was, arrived here from Russian Poland as a pack peddler in 1893. In 1895, he opened his first store on the corner of Main and 3rd. In 1897, he opened his second store. The department store Tip Top, he opened in 1901. It is now the largest department store in Duma, Arkansas. And so what I could also find out from that obituary was what happened to his children. Okay, and I can show you none of them were peddlers, and some of them, one of them may have actually gone to work for the father in the department store, but most of them were doing other kinds of things. I could also find out what were his civic involvements. So he belongs to the Masons. Okay, he served on the school board, okay, maybe on the road commission, okay, and he was a founding member of the Hebrew synagogue. Okay, so there in these obituaries you get these very ordinary people. Okay, again, they're not the Guggenheims. Okay, but you still see what it had meant to be a peddler from Russian Poland in 1893 to end up with, you know, a pretty lengthy obituary in the Duma Gazette. Okay.
There's a woman.
Okay.
So you've alluded a little bit to the family lives.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. So the question was about their family lives and was this pre-marriage or post-marriage? And it really depended. I'd say generally in the earlier period till about the 1860s, 70s, most of them were single men. So they migrated alone. And once they had saved enough money that they wanted to marry, some of them actually went back to Europe or to the Ottoman Empire and found a bride. Okay. Others relied on local Jewish networks to find a marriage partner. I should say there were also some who marry local women, non-Jewish women, and there are conversions to Judaism in some cases not. But again, a large number of in the earlier period were unmarried. Later on, you see much more in the way of married men, and they have a couple strategies. Some of them leave their wives and children in the old home. Okay, and only send for them when they've opened the store. Okay, so that means the wives and the children, the impact on the family is tremendous that these wives and children have years without the father. Okay, and somebody needs to study what the women did when they were alone and how they built community and how they coped. Some of the men did bring their wives and children to the new country, but left them in like a big city. Okay, and in fact, I had gotten onto this project because we had gone on a tour of a restored synagogue in the Adirondacks called in Tupper Lake, and they said that the men who had started it left their wives and children in New York City. They peddled in the Adirondacks, and then one by one, as they opened their stores, they sent for the wives and children. Sometimes, again, the numbers are just absolutely elusive, but in some of these narratives, the wives and children are in that hub of Jewish life. They might be living in Duma, Arkansas, while the husband is peddling in the area. So they see the husband, you know, once a week, you know, for the weekend. I think it's very notable that in all of these most of these New World places, the first formal Jewish institutions were founded by women. Okay, and I think that women are alone, and so they found the first charitable society. Okay, and so it's, I think, a certain power and responsibility that if the husbands had been around, they couldn't do.
So, you thought we were a museum, but we also peddle books here at the Tenement Museum. And there's a book we've been talking about a lot tonight that we would love to sell to you tonight, and you will have it signed. We offer, our special offer tonight is that if you buy it tonight, you get 15% off Roads Taken. And then we have another offer, and that is that one of the peddlers who would sell herring from the street 100 years ago was a man named Joel Russ. His great-granddaughter now runs a wonderful restaurant a block away, who are now partnering with us in support of Tenement Talks to offer 10% off to those who attend Tenement Talks and buy a book. So you hear 10% off the book, 15% off the book, 10% off a meal at Russ & Daughters, which is just down the block. So I've done my pitches, but I also, first of all, want to thank Hasia and thank Nancy for joining us and sharing so many of the wonderful stories and ideas from the book, for Nancy for illuminating them and doing that work of not only delving into the book itself, but then also making contemporary connections. And I love the connection to the Chinese restaurant workers. I thought that was brilliant. So thank you, and thank you for all of your wonderful questions. and to learn, and we hope to see you again at the Tenement Museum next week. Worn Stories. It's about clothing. It's about rags, but it's about the stories that people associate with clothing. So we'll hear from Emily Spivak, and this book was selected Maria Popova's Brain Pickings, a big internet phenomenon, social media phenomenon, picked it as #1 or one of the top books of 2014. So she'll be here to interview her, as well as hearing some of the stories of the contributors to the book, who will be sharing their stories as well. And then in 2 weeks, we have Richard Price, author of Lush Life, to talk about his new book, The Whites, in conversation with a local Chinatown author, detective writer. So we're really excited about that. And we'll end March with Alice Kessler-Harris in conversation with Laura Vopnik on Laura Vopnik's new book on Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. So we go from peddlers to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a lot of firebrands, and we hope to see you again at the Tenement Museum. And also, to support us, if you'd like to become a member, we also would love that too. But thank you, Hasia, and thank you, Nancy, so much.